Drew Lawson, or just Drew to his friends, glanced at his cell phone after leaving a voicemail for his wife of 5 years, Jessica, though she preferred being called Jess. He had just finalized a major service contract with a well-known California company that had offices across the country. His boss, Tom Richards, would be thrilled. This contract promised a big boost in business for their IT firm and a sizable raise for Drew himself. With that new financial security, Drew started thinking it might finally be the right time to start a family with Jess, like they'd always planned. But a nagging feeling had lingered ever since he returned from a camping trip with Tom about a week ago. Jess hadn't been herself. She seemed distant, distracted. Worse, she'd started snapping at him over the smallest things, like she was irritated by his very presence. Then came the moment he couldn't ignore. After they'd unpacked from his trip and tossed clothes in the laundry basket, he noticed something odd in the gusset of her underwear. When he picked them up, he felt a hardened substance and was hit by a distinct smell that he couldn't ignore. The realization crashed over him, making his stomach twist. Needing answers, Drew consulted a lawyer to explore his options. If Jess had betrayed him, it would mean the end of their marriage. He had to know the truth, especially with his upcoming business trip to the West Coast. Laura Spencer, a family lawyer his recently divorced friend recommended, asked him point blank, "Are you certain your wife is cheating?" "Not 100%, Drew replied, "but I need proof, and if she is, I want a divorce." Laura explained that while most divorces in the state didn't place blame, filing on the grounds of infidelity was possible, but he'd need solid evidence. Like photos or videos? Drew asked. Exactly, Laura nodded. "I can hire a private investigator to find out for sure, if that's what you want." Drew agreed, feeling a deep resolve settle over him. "Let's do it," he said. "I'll be out of town for 3 days, so I think that'll be the perfect time to find out." Laura called her investigator, Ethan Blake, who suggested Drew install a tracking app on Jess's phone. Ethan also handed him a device to record calls on their landline and an audio recorder he could slip into her purse. Drew felt a pang of shame as he considered using these tools, but he had to know the truth. Other unsettling signs had emerged since the camping trip, too. Tom had become oddly smug and patronizing, like he held some secret Drew didn't know. He could hardly stand it. A week later, Jess drove him to the airport. She kissed him goodbye, and he told her, "I'll call you tonight after dinner." "All right, honey," she replied. "Have a good flight." But something about her tone felt hollow. That night, Drew called as promised and was caught off guard when Jess mentioned she'd be working as a waitress at a party Tom was hosting. One of the waitresses was supposedly out sick, and Tom had offered her $150 to fill in. Jess said she could use the extra cash, since her teaching job wouldn't start up for a couple of weeks. Drew knew money had been a little tight, but something about her taking that job bothered him. "Okay, go ahead," he said, keeping his tone calm. "Just be careful, and tell me all about it tomorrow, okay?" "Of course," she replied a little too cheerily. "You know I love you, right?" "Yeah," he said. "I love you too." But as he hung up, a knot tightened in his stomach. Drew immediately called Ethan. "Just wanted to let you know Jess said she's going to be waitressing at a party at Tom Richards' place tonight," he told the investigator. "Understood," Ethan replied. "We'll keep tabs on her and update you." The following day, Drew called Jess's cell, but she didn't answer. He tried the home phone, only to reach the answering machine. He tried to assure himself that she hadn't stayed the night with Tom, but his stomach dropped when an email from Ethan came through that afternoon. Jess stayed the night at Richards' house. "She's still there," it read, followed by, "She was very active last night." Attached are a few photos. Be warned, they're explicit. "I'll provide a full report when you're back." Drew opened the attachments, and his heart shattered. There was Jess, his wife of 5 years, in compromising scenes with 3 men he'd once considered friends. His hands trembled, and he felt hot tears sting his eyes. It was unbearable. He tried calling her again, but it went straight to voicemail just like before. He dialed the home phone, but again, only the machine picked up. Without leaving a message, he headed to the hotel bar, desperate to drown his sorrows. The next morning, Drew checked the tracker app and saw that Jess's phone was still at Tom's place, confirming she was still there. Ethan soon followed up with another email, attaching 2 more photos. They were even more graphic than the last, this time involving 10 men including Tom, his son Ryan, and 5 other employees from Tom's IT firm. These were people he once counted on as trustworthy colleagues, but that sense of loyalty was long gone. Drew didn't recognize 3 of the men in the photos, assuming they must be friends of Tom's son, Ryan. Once he'd wrapped up business with his California client, he checked out of the hotel early and caught a flight home, the contract in hand but his mind somewhere else entirely. A cab took him home, and he noticed right away that Jess's car wasn't in the driveway. When he checked the tracker, it confirmed her phone was still at Tom's place. Stepping inside, he changed clothes and called Laura's office. To his surprise, her receptionist informed him that Laura was available for a meeting that afternoon. Trying to maintain some normalcy, Drew called Jess's cell. She answered, her voice a little breathless. "Hello," she said. "Hey, it's me," Drew replied, his tone steady. "Where are you?" "Oh, I'm home," she lied without hesitation, just finishing up a few things before class starts. Drew almost choked on the audacity of it. "Got it," he said, playing along. "Well, I'm done here in California, so I'll be heading home soon." "Oh, okay," she responded smoothly. "I've missed you so much. Call me when you land, and I'll come pick you up." "No, don't worry about it. I'll take a taxi," he replied and hung up, leaving out the usual "I love you." He couldn't care less if she noticed. Jess stared at the phone for a second after the call ended. Normally, Drew would have ended the call with an "I love you," but this time, he hadn't. His tone hadn't sounded warm either. She'd meant to go home after that first night, but lying between Tom and his son had felt too satisfying to leave. She told herself she deserved it somehow. Besides, once her classes started again, all this would be behind her, and Drew would be none the wiser. So she'd stayed another day and night with Tom and Ryan. On that second day, Tom went off to work for a few hours, leaving Ryan to keep her company. He even called up some of his friends to join them. When Tom returned, Jess was already entangled with Ryan on Tom's bed. As they wrapped up, Tom shot her a sly grin and said, "Maybe I should send your husband away more often." "My classes are starting again soon," she replied. "I won't be able to do this once he's back home." Tom chuckled. "What? Afraid your husband will find out what it's like to watch a real man handle you?" They both laughed, and Jess found herself nodding along. "I've got to admit, I had a great time," she said, "but I still love Drew. I don't want to hurt him." "Well, I could arrange to have him sent out of town again sometime," Tom suggested. "That way, you can keep coming around." She giggled but replied, "Sounds tempting, but sooner or later, Drew's going to find out. He's not stupid, you know." Tom shrugged, holding up a video camera with a grin. "Don't you worry about Drummy. I got him covered. But there's just one thing." "What's that?" she asked, arching a brow. "No more sleeping with him," Tom said, sounding almost serious. "You're ours now. Get used to it." "But how am I supposed to make that work?" she asked. "Come up with something. So you've got a headache or whatever." "You'll figure it out," Tom said confidently. Jess nodded. "All right, I'll try." Later that day, Ryan's friends dropped by for another round, and even Tom invited a few of his single buddies from their group. She found herself enjoying the whole thing more than she ever expected. By then, she'd become the life of their twisted party. Meanwhile, Drew was shattered as he reviewed the evidence Ethan had gathered. Besides the incriminating photos, there were 2 DVDs with videos showing Jess doing things with these men that she'd never even considered with him. Watching her so freely give herself to others left him numb. His love for her faded with each frame. Laura offered him some words of comfort, but it felt hollow. How could Jess just turn on him like this after 5 years? What had he done to deserve this betrayal? And as for Tom, he'd thought of the man as a friend, but clearly he'd been wrong. Laura broke his thoughts with a practical suggestion. "I'll file the divorce on grounds of infidelity," she said. "If you want, we could also pursue an alienation of affection claim against Tom and some of the men involved. It might not get far, but we'd likely see a decent settlement." "Do what you have to," Drew muttered, barely able to muster any strength. "But don't do anything rash," Laura warned him. "I don't want to be bailing you out of jail over this." Drew shook his head. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm keeping my cool. When will the papers be ready?" "Give me a couple of days, and I'll have everything set up," Laura replied. "In the meantime, try to act normal around Jess." I'm not much of an actor, he admitted, and I'll never touch her again. God only knows what she could have picked up from all those men. Just tell her you're not feeling well, Laura advised. It'll buy you some time. Drew nodded. All right, I'll do that, he said, heading out of her office. Sitting in his car afterward, Drew felt the weight of another realization. There was no way he could work with Tom anymore, nor could he stomach being around men who had betrayed him so deeply. Taking out his phone, he scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he wanted. He dialed and hoped for a bit of good fortune. Wallace, answered the voice on the other end. Henry, it's Drew Lawson, Drew said, recognizing the warmth in his old friend's tone. Drew, how are you, my friend? Could be better, Drew replied, masking the hurt in his voice. Listen, is that spot at Empire still available? Henry Wallace, the CEO of Empire, had been trying to recruit Drew for a while, but Drew had stayed with Tom out of loyalty. Now that loyalty was worthless. Of course it is, Henry answered. You finally thinking of joining a reputable company? Yeah, something like that, Drew replied with a dry chuckle. Some things have come up, and I realized I can't stay there anymore. I'm sorry to hear that, Drew, Henry said, his voice full of concern. Is there anything I can do? Just give me a job, Drew said simply. I'll work as hard for you as I did for Tom, Drew promised Henry, feeling a weight begin to lift. Glad to hear it, Henry replied. Can you start Monday? Absolutely, Drew answered. Great. Why don't you and your wife come by tonight? Henry offered. Linda makes a lasagna that's worth the trip, and we can go over the compensation package too. Drew hesitated, then sighed. I'd love to, but I can't bring my wife. Why not? Henry asked, concern in his voice. I'd rather explain tonight, if that's all right. Of course, Drew, Henry said gently. You know, Linda is a licensed counselor. She could help if you need it. Drew appreciated the offer. Thanks, Henry. I'd really appreciate it. All right, I'll tell her. 6:30. Perfect, Drew replied, relief starting to set in. After ending the call, he felt lighter and ready to move forward. Driving home, Drew noticed Jess's car still wasn't in the driveway. Inside, he showered, changed, and sat at his computer to write his resignation letter. He knew his future lay anywhere but with Tom. Around 5 p.m., Jess came home, catching him by surprise at his desk. She went to kiss him, but he turned his face so her kiss landed on his cheek instead. She looked at him, startled. Is everything okay? Not really, he replied flatly. I don't feel well. Might be jet lag. I'll sleep on the futon tonight. When you get back, where are you going? I'm meeting someone for dinner, he said. Are you seeing another woman? She asked, her tone laced with worry. You mean, am I cheating? He replied dryly. No, Jess, I'm not. Never did. Can you say the same? She looked stunned. Of course I can, she stammered, but he didn't buy it. So, she said, trying to change the subject, how was California? It was fine, he said. And how'd things go with that job at Tom's house? Oh, fine, she replied, trying to sound casual. Even though it was hard, I still had a good time. Bet you did, he said coldly, glancing at his watch. Well, I'd better go, he told her, saving his work and shutting down the computer. He stood up and brushed past her without a word. She watched him walk away, unsure of what to think. How long will you be gone? She asked. I don't know, he replied shortly. Don't wait up. He left without the usual kiss or I love you. After his car pulled away, she nervously picked up the home phone and called Tom, unaware the call was recorded. Tom, I think he suspects something, she said. What makes you say that? He asked, sounding curious. He didn't touch me or say he loved me. He seemed cold and just left. Who's he meeting? He didn't say, she replied, her voice wavering. Tom, what if he knows? What if he's planning to leave me? So what? Tom laughed. You can stay with us. And don't worry. I'll keep him so busy he'll hardly be around. But I don't want to lose him, Tom. I love him. Tom laughed. Sure, Jess. You've shown us all just how much you love him the past 2 days. It's not funny, Tom. I know what I did, and yeah, I enjoyed it. But I still love him. Relax, he said condescendingly. Let him blow off steam. If he doesn't come around, we'll handle it. You're not going to hurt him, are you? She asked, worried. Nothing drastic, Tom replied. You just have to show him things are different now, and you'll help with that. What? She asked, alarmed. When the time comes, you'll help us explain things. Remember who you belong to now, he added, a hint of menace in his voice. You wouldn't want the school board seeing certain videos, would you? You wouldn't dare, she whispered, horrified. Oh, but I would, he said smugly. I've got plenty of footage of you in compromising situations. Keep Drew in line, or else. Defeated, Jess sighed. All right, Tom, but don't hurt him. Tom chuckled. Sure, Jess, he said, ending the call. Meanwhile, Drew arrived at Henry and Linda Wallace's house, a large, inviting two-story home. He stepped out of the car, holding a bottle of wine he'd picked up on the way. Henry opened the door and greeted him warmly, accepting the wine. Come on in, Drew, Henry said, patting him on the shoulder. And thanks, this will go well with dinner. Henry led Drew into the dining room, where his wife, Linda, was setting down a hot lasagna. Drew, meet my wife, Linda, Henry said warmly. Linda, this is Drew Lawson, our new customer service rep. Linda smiled as she shook Drew's hand. Nice to meet you, Drew. And please call me Linda. Mrs. Wallace feels so formal. Once seated, Linda served generous portions of lasagna while Henry poured the wine. Drew took a bite and couldn't help but praise her. This is amazing. Best lasagna I've ever had. Linda laughed, pleased. Thank you, Drew. I'm glad you like it. After a few bites, Henry leaned forward. Not to pry, but I'm curious. What prompted you to leave Tom's company so quickly? Drew hesitated, then nodded. Something happened that made staying impossible, he replied, glancing down before starting his story. He kept it brief but told them about Jess's betrayal and Tom's part in it. As he spoke, the weight of his situation felt heavier than ever. When he finished, Henry shook his head. That's rough, Drew. I went through something similar once, though not quite this bad. So, what's your plan now? Drew sighed, feeling the reality of it settle in. I filed for divorce. My lawyer says it'll be an even split, which is fair, I guess, but it's still hard to believe it's come to this. Linda looked at him kindly. Have you considered counseling? It might help, even if it's just to find closure. Drew shook his head. It's gone too far. She's like a different person now. I don't recognize her anymore, and I can hardly look at her. Linda nodded thoughtfully. I'm a licensed psychologist, and if you'd like, I could see you for an hour each week. It might help to have someone to talk to. Drew looked surprised. You do that? I'd really appreciate it, Linda. Henry smiled, resting a hand on Drew's shoulder. Trust me, she's the best. She helped me get through some tough times too. Thank you, Drew replied sincerely, feeling grateful for the support. After dinner, Henry looked at Linda with a smile. If you don't mind, Linda, I'd like to take Drew to my office to discuss his new role. Not at all, she replied, smiling at Drew. And I look forward to working with you, Drew. Drew thanked her and followed Henry to his home office, where Henry poured them each a glass of brandy. They discussed Drew's responsibilities, company goals, and compensation. By the end, Drew felt like he had a new path forward, one that he controlled. When he left, Drew shook Henry's hand, feeling like he was finally stepping into a future he could shape. It was around 10 p.m. when he arrived home, and he saw the lights were still on. He walked inside, where Jess sat on the sofa. So, how did your meeting go? She asked, trying to sound casual. Very well, Drew replied curtly. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to bed. He turned toward the second bedroom, where he'd set up his computer. She followed him down the hall, frowning. Are you sleeping here now? Yes. I'm not feeling well, so I'll be on the futon, he replied, keeping his tone neutral. Oh, she hesitated. Since you've been gone, I thought maybe we could spend some time together. Drew couldn't hide his distaste. Not tonight, he replied bluntly. Maybe tomorrow, he added, though he doubted he'd ever want to again. Jess looked down, hiding her hurt. All right, she said quietly, turning back to the living room, but the tension in her voice made Drew wonder if she suspected he knew. The next morning, Drew rose early, gathered his things, and took his resignation letter. He noticed Jess's purse on the kitchen table and retrieved the audio recorder he'd planted. Transferring her recent conversation with Tom to his computer, he felt a grim satisfaction. Without saying goodbye, he left the apartment, hearing her stir as he closed the door. Arriving at the office, he acknowledged his secretary briefly and went straight into his office to gather his belongings. It didn't take long before Tom showed up, visibly confused. "What's all this?" Tom asked, noting the boxes on Drew's desk. Drew handed him 2 envelopes. One's the signed contract from California. The other is my resignation, effective immediately. I expect my final paycheck, vacation pay, and the bonus. Tom's face contorted in shock. Resignation? Why? I need you here, Drew. Drew shook his head, a bitter smile on his face. Do you really think I'm clueless, Tom? I know exactly what's been going on. I can't work here anymore. Tom's demeanor shifted, turning defensive. So, that's what this is about. Yeah, Tom? That's what it's about, Drew replied coldly. He gave Tom one final, dismissive look and walked out, ready to start a life where betrayal would no longer have a place. Well, just so you know, Tom sneered, leaning back in his chair, your wife was more than willing. There's no need to let this ruin your career, Drew. Just go with the flow, let Jess sow some wild oats, and when she's done, she'll be all yours again. Drew's face hardened as he suppressed his disgust. Do you honestly think I'd go along with that? He replied icily. How long has this been going on? Tom smirked, clearly enjoying Drew's reaction. First time was at the campsite. Second day, while you were off skiing. She practically begged for it, said I was bigger than you, and that you weren't satisfying her. I just gave her what she wanted. Drew felt his stomach churn, his voice tight. And that's why you suddenly insisted I head back to the office, right? To get me out of the way? Tom chuckled, his smugness infuriating. Exactly. She wanted it, I wanted it, everyone wins. You're finally seeing things clearly. And her waitressing at your party. Was that another setup to get her alone? Drew asked, his tone ice cold. Tom shrugged. You catch on fast, Drew. I wanted her there, and it was easy to arrange. You wouldn't believe how eager she was. Drew's jaw tightened. Without missing a beat, he took out his phone, ending the recording he'd started when Tom entered the office. Thanks for the confession, he said, his voice measured and deadly calm. Now, if you don't mind, I'll head to HR. Tom's expression faltered, realizing the weight of what had just happened. Wait, you can't use that recording against me, he protested, his tone desperate. We'll see, Drew replied, gathering his things, his calmness unwavering. As Drew packed, Tom made one last attempt. You forgot something? He held up the framed photo of Jess from Drew's desk, sneering as he waved it mockingly. Drew looked back, unmoved. Keep it, he replied coldly. You wanted her so badly. She's yours now. I'm done with both of you. With that, he walked out, not sparing Tom another glance. Tom stared after him, a flicker of doubt creeping into his confident facade as he realized how quickly his scheme had unraveled. Soon after, Tom called Jess. She answered, her voice anxious. What do you mean he resigned? She demanded. What did you say to him? Tom shrugged, his tone dismissive. He asked questions, so I told him the truth about the first time at the campsite. You're an idiot, she snapped, panic thick in her voice. I told you not to say anything. He asked. Tom replied flatly. And he even left the picture of you from his desk. Told me he didn't need it anymore. Jess's heart sank as she struggled to process what this meant. So what now? She asked, her voice cracking. Not my problem, Tom replied indifferently. He's your husband. You handle it. Hanging up, Jess broke down, unable to stop the tears. She hadn't wanted it to end like this, but now she realized Drew knew everything. She sat on the sofa, sobbing as she grappled with the weight of her choices, wondering if there was anything she could do to keep him. Meanwhile, Drew pulled into his driveway. He saw Jess's car parked out front, and though relieved not to see Tom's, his mind was racing. Grabbing his box and briefcase, he went inside. Jess sat on the couch, her eyes red from crying, looking up as he walked past her without a word, locking himself in his office. He took a steadying breath, then checked his phone for recordings. He found her conversation with Tom from earlier and immediately forwarded it to his lawyer. When he called her, she answered with a professional, concerned tone. Hi, Drew. I just received your email. I'll prepare the documents right away. When can they be submitted? Drew asked, keeping his voice steady. If you're ready, I can expedite things. My bailiff can deliver them this afternoon, she offered. That works, he said, feeling a grim satisfaction as he hung up. He walked over to his safe, unlocking it to retrieve his old .45 caliber pistol. He had no intention of using it, but wanted to be prepared if Tom, or Jess tried anything. He entered the kitchen, setting his briefcase down and placing the gun within easy reach. Jess looked up, startled by the weapon's presence. "We need to talk," he said calmly, his voice firm. Her eyes flickered nervously to the gun. "Is that really necessary?" she asked, her voice wavering. "I hope not," he replied coldly. "But I want to be prepared if your friend decides to make a surprise visit." "My friend?" she stammered, feigning innocence. "Let's not play games, Jess. Now sit down." She obeyed, visibly shaken as she took a seat across from him. "Later today," Drew began, "someone will come by with some papers for you." Her face drained of color as she realized what he meant. "Divorce papers?" she whispered, a hint of desperation creeping into her voice. "Why? I don't want a divorce. I love you." Drew scoffed, unable to contain his anger. "Love? Don't insult me. I know everything about you, Tom, his son, and the others you've been with." Her voice faltered as she tried to find words. "You don't have any proof," she whispered. Drew pulled an envelope from his briefcase, laying time-stamped photos on the table. Images of her with Tom and others. Unmistakable and damning. "Would you like to see the videos or listen to the recordings?" he asked coldly. Her face twisted in horror, and she shook her head as tears filled her eyes, realizing how much he knew. "Good," he said, gathering the photos. "You destroyed us the moment you decided to betray me. I'll be out of here soon, and I'd prefer you to be gone by the time I return." Jess's voice broke as she tried one last time. "Please, Drew. I made a mistake. I don't want to lose you. I'll do anything to make it right." "It's far too late for that," Drew replied, his voice firm. "Consider this the end." As Drew stood, retrieving his belongings, she clutched her face in her hands, unable to stop the tears as she realized she had lost him completely. When he walked out the door, a strange calm settled over him. It wasn't happiness, but the weight of betrayal had finally lifted. He was done, leaving Jess, Tom, and their lives firmly behind him. "No support," Drew stated coldly. "You get half of what's in the bank, we each keep our pensions, and you can take all your things. I've already paid off and canceled your credit card. Here's a cashier's check for your share of what's left. And there's a restraining order requiring you to stay at least 150 meters away from me, my home, and my workplace." Jess's face crumpled. "Are you kicking me out?" she asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "That's about right," he replied calmly. "What if I contest the divorce?" she asked, grasping at any control she could. Drew laughed coldly. "I wouldn't advise that. What do you think the school board would say if certain photos and videos happen to surface? Think the parents of your students want someone like you teaching their kids?" "You wouldn't dare," she gasped. "Care to test me?" he asked, holding her gaze. She lowered her head. "No," she whispered. "I need my job." "Then that's how it'll be," Drew said. "There's more. You'll give back your wedding rings and give up my last name." "Oh my God. You've become a heartless prick, haven't you?" she said, slipping off her rings. "Yes, and you gave me plenty of reason," he replied, his tone unyielding. "I have just one question. What happened to turn you into this?" She took a deep breath. "It started on the second day of the hike. You were on the boat, and I was lying in the tent. Tom walked by, saw me undressed, and came in. At first, he seemed embarrassed, but then he pulled his pants down, and that was it. So, some guy takes off his pants, and you just jump on him? That's all it took." Drew's voice was filled with disgust. "How many times were there?" "Twice," she admitted, "while you were jet skiing, and then later when Tom sent you back to the office." Drew shook his head, pointing at the photos. "None of them used protection. You weren't worried about getting pregnant or sick." "I'm still on the pill," she mumbled. "That doesn't stop everything," Drew said sharply. "Did you even think about the risks?" "Oh God, no," she whispered, shaking her head. "This wasn't what I wanted." Drew looked at her with a mixture of pity and anger. "In all our years together, I turned down women who looked like goddesses next to you. Do you know why? Because I thought I had a loyal, loving wife. But you didn't even think twice about me, did you? Drew, please, I know. I hope it was worth it. Now pack up. When the papers are served, I want you gone." "Please," she pleaded. "Can't we see a counselor? I swear I'll never do it again. Can't you forgive me this once?" Drew's face was as cold as she'd ever seen it. "Forgive? Never. Maybe if it had been a one-time mistake, I could consider it. But no, you weren't forced. You didn't care how this would destroy me. The sight of you makes me sick. The sooner you're out of my life, the better. Now go pack. Anything you leave behind will be burned or donated." Sobbing, she got up and went to the bedroom. Drew watched her drag out one garbage bag after another, each one seeming to weigh her down more. Finally, she stopped, looking at him with tear-filled eyes. "Can you at least help me carry these to the car?" "No," Drew replied flatly. "It's your trash. You deal with it. Remember, anything left here gets burned, including your wedding dress." Her face twisted in horror. "You wouldn't burn my wedding dress. My parents spent thousands on that." "Then take it with you if it means that much," Drew replied coldly. Sobbing, she carried each bag to the car, loading up until she was exhausted. She looked at him, pleading, "I can't fit everything in. Can I come back later for the rest?" "No. You're not allowed within 150 meters of this place. Ask your parents if they can come pick it up. I'll hold off on tossing it out for a few days." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small. "What am I going to tell my parents?" "Try telling them the truth," Drew replied. "Tell them you cheated on me with my boss and others, and I kicked you out." Her face drained of color. "If I tell them that, they'll disown me. Not my problem. But try to twist this around, and it'll be worse for you. Your parents hate liars." A knock on the door interrupted them. Drew glanced at her. "I think that's for you." Jess walked to the door slowly, opening it to find a deputy sheriff standing there, holding an envelope. Her hands shook as she took it, knowing her life had officially fallen apart. "Candace Lawson?" the deputy sheriff asked as she opened the door. She nodded. "Yes, that's me." "Do you have any identification?" he asked. She pulled out her driver's license, and after a quick check, he handed her an envelope. "You've been served, ma'am," he said. "You're required to vacate the premises immediately. You can sign the divorce papers now if you'd like." Nodding numbly, Jess asked for a pen and signed the documents. "I'll return these to the lawyer," the deputy said, then added, "If you try to come back, you'll be arrested. Do you understand?" "Yes," she replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked back at Drew, her face full of regret. "I'm so sorry, Drew." "Yeah, me too," Drew said coldly. "Goodbye." "Goodbye," she whispered as she walked out. The deputy gave Drew a nod before leaving. The following days were a whirlwind for Drew. Jess didn't try to contact him, but Tom called twice, leaving angry, threatening voicemails. "Damn it, Drew, I know you're there," Tom shouted. "If you don't drop this lawsuit, I'll come over and kick your back in." Drew saved the voicemails, forwarded them to his lawyer, Laura, who promptly alerted the local sheriff's department. Jess's parents also reached out, asking if they could come by to pick up more of her things. "Yes, of course," Drew said. "Just make sure Jess isn't with you. She's got a restraining order." When Frank, Jess's father, and her mother, Martha, arrived, they gathered what Jess had left behind, but Martha couldn't resist trying to reason with Drew. "Drew, she made a mistake," Martha said gently. "Can't you forgive her? She's crazy about you." Drew's expression remained hard. "What did she tell you, Martha?" Martha hesitated. "She only said she had a fight with your boss." "And that's all?" "Yes, that's all she said. We didn't press her." Drew grabbed an envelope containing photos and DVDs, handing them over. Martha and Frank looked, horrified at what they saw. "I'm sorry she didn't tell you the full story," Drew said. "As you can see, it's worse than she let on." Martha was speechless, her face pale. I had no idea it was this bad. I'm so sorry, Drew. I understand why you're doing this." Frank's face turned purple with rage. "I'll have a long talk with our foolish daughter," he said angrily. "Have you done anything else with these photos?" Drew shook his head. "Not yet, but I warned her not to contest the divorce." They expressed their sympathy before leaving, taking the last of Jess's belongings with them. Later that evening, as Drew was watching TV, there was a loud knock at the door. Peeking through the peephole, he saw Tom, Ryan, and two other former colleagues. Quickly, Drew went to his office, grabbed his firearm, and called emergency services. He opened the door slightly, the weapon held out of view, but they forced their way in. "We're going to kick your back in," Tom snarled. Drew stepped back, raising the gun. You're not really going to shoot us, are you, Drew? Tom challenged. You don't have the courage. Want to test that? Drew replied calmly. Emergency services have been called, and the police are on their way. Stick around, and you'll all be arrested for violating the restraining order. One of the men looked at Tom nervously. Tom, I think he's serious. At that moment, the sound of sirens and flashing lights came into view. Yes, Tom, I'm serious, Drew said. Tom and the others turned to leave, only to find two large police officers at the doorway. Drew lowered his weapon, stepping back. Put the weapon down, sir, one officer instructed. Drew complied, setting it on the kitchen table. Officer, these people violated a restraining order, he explained. They forced their way in and threatened me. I want them arrested. Do you have a copy of the order? The officer asked. Drew retrieved it from the kitchen, handing it over. The officer reviewed it carefully before turning to the four intruders. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, he commanded. Glaring at Drew, they had no choice but to comply as the officers handcuffed them, reading them their rights. Once they were secured, one officer turned to Drew. Do you have a license for this firearm? Yes, I do, Drew replied, showing his driver's license and NRA firearms training card. The officer nodded. Good. Be cautious with it, he advised. Understood, officer. Thank you, Drew said, grateful for their help. Over the next 3 months, Drew's life finally started to stabilize. He enjoyed working at Empire far more than he had with Tom, and weekly counseling sessions with Linda helped him process the anger and rebuild his trust in others. He joined a gym, committed to working out 3 days a week, and even started martial arts classes, not only for self-defense but for the mental discipline it brought him. In time, Drew began to feel like himself again, leaving behind the people who had wronged him and stepping confidently into a life he could control. Drew committed to a new diet and exercise program suggested by Linda, finding both physical and mental benefits. The divorce itself was finalized quickly, with Jess not contesting it. However, the alienation of affection lawsuits were more complicated. Laura warned Drew that Tom and his colleagues might eventually face professional consequences, and sure enough, 2 of them were fired. But the case against Tom held the biggest surprise. After reviewing the evidence, including financial records, the judge ruled in Drew's favor, ordering Tom to pay $1 million in damages. At the end of the trial, the judge addressed Tom sternly. Mr. Richards, your actions are beyond reprehensible, he said. You exploited a friend's trust, using your position as his employer to destroy his marriage and family. Furthermore, you repeatedly violated a restraining order. I find in favor of the plaintiff and order you to pay $1 million in damages. Tom's lawyer, Mr. Gallagher, stood up protesting. Your Honor, this is an unusual judgment. The judge's face hardened. Mr. Gallagher, Mr. Richards' behavior was not just illegal, but disgraceful. The decision stands. He added, if there's any delay in payment, Mr. Richards can expect a contempt charge and jail time. Reluctantly, Tom issued a check, which was handed to Laura, who then passed it to Drew. To his surprise, the check cleared without issue, allowing Drew to settle Laura's fees. In the weeks that followed, word spread about the lawsuit, and several of Tom's clients reached out to Drew. Companies were reluctant to do business with someone who would go so far as to ruin a friend's marriage, and Drew suspected that Tom's business might not survive the year. Despite interest from several women at Empire, Drew refused to date until the divorce was final. When the official papers came through, he celebrated quietly with friends from work, feeling a new chapter truly begin. A few months later, he received an unexpected call from Jess's mother, Martha. Drew, do you have a few minutes? She asked. Of course, Martha, he replied. What's going on? It's Jess. She was just diagnosed as HIV positive, Martha said quietly. Drew felt a pang, but replied evenly. I'm sorry to hear that, Martha. But it doesn't surprise me. The divorce is final, and I'm not responsible for her anymore. I know, Martha said, her voice strained. I was hoping you might come and talk to her, just for a few minutes. After a pause, Drew sighed. All right, Martha, I'll come by for a short visit. When he arrived at Martha and Frank's house, he was startled by Jess's appearance. She looked frail, far removed from the woman he'd once known. She attempted to approach him, but he held up his hand, stopping her. Hurt. She took a seat and gestured for him to sit. You look good, Drew, she said softly. Better than I remember. Thank you, Jess. Things have changed for me. New job, new friends, new outlook. How are you? Not well, she admitted. I assume you know about the HIV diagnosis. Yes, Martha told me, he replied. I'm sorry to hear it, but it doesn't surprise me. Do you know when you contracted it? Jess looked down, her voice shaky. I think it was one of the nights at Tom's. That weekend, I wasn't careful. Does Tom know? Drew asked. No, not yet, she admitted. But I'll have to tell him. I doubt he'll take it well. I wouldn't expect him to, Drew replied. She took a deep breath, then looked him in the eye. Drew, I just wanted to apologize one last time. I know that what I did hurt you and others, and now I'm paying the price. I could have stopped myself, but I didn't. I was foolish and selfish, and I traded a wonderful husband for a moment of excitement. I know I have no right to ask this, but I don't want to go to my grave without your forgiveness. Drew sat silently, considering her words. It was the first time he had seen her genuinely take responsibility. He could continue hating her, but he remembered his sessions with Linda and the idea of letting go for his own peace. Holding a grudge against Jess would only keep him stuck in the past, Drew realized. He nodded. All right, Jess, he said. I forgive you. Jess broke down in tears, slumping into her chair. Drew thought about reaching out to comfort her, but hesitated. She looked up, wiping her eyes. Thank you, Drew. This means more to me than you know, she said, her voice filled with relief. I want you to find a woman you can trust. Marry her, have children. You deserve that. Thank you, Drew replied, touched despite himself. And if you ever want to talk, I'm here. She nodded, managing a small smile. I will. I've missed you these past few months, Drew. He nodded. I miss the woman I married, he said simply. By the way, how are things with Tom and Ryan? Her face darkened. Not good. Tom's been cruel since losing to you in court, and his business has suffered. She hesitated. He hasn't hurt me physically, but he's become harsh. Do you want me there when you tell him about your diagnosis? Drew asked gently. No, she said, shaking her head. This is my responsibility. I keep thinking that if I'd only told him to leave that first day on the camping trip, none of this would have happened. Maybe, Drew agreed, but I think he was determined to push things as far as he could. You're right, she said quietly. I need to rest before heading back. Thank you for coming. It means so much. You're welcome, Jess, he said. Remember, if you ever need to talk. Thank you, she replied softly, and as she watched him leave, she whispered, Goodbye, Drew. Please think of me from time to time. He sensed a finality in her words and wondered if she meant to harm herself. Just don't do anything stupid, okay? She gave him a weak smile. I won't, she said. Before he left, Martha hugged him. Thank you, Drew. This means a lot to her. And to me. You're welcome, Martha, he said. Keep an eye on her, okay? I will, she promised. A few weeks later, while watching the evening news, Drew heard a report that made him freeze. The bodies of a local businessman, his son, and a woman believed to be his mistress were found earlier today in what appears to be a murder-suicide, the anchor said. Jacob Richards, president of Richards Consulting, his son, and an unidentified woman were all victims of gunshot wounds. Authorities are investigating. Drew's heart sank. He called Martha, who answered, sobbing. Martha, what's going on? He asked. We just found out that Jess is dead, she said, her voice choked with grief. Apparently, that bastard Tom shot her, then his son, and himself. Oh my God, Drew whispered, feeling a wave of shock and sadness. I saw the report and prayed it wasn't her. It was, Martha replied, her voice hollow. The police think she told Tom about her diagnosis, and he lost his mind. They're doing an autopsy now. I'm so sorry, Martha, Drew said quietly. I never wanted any of this to happen. I know, Drew. Jess made her choices, and now she's paid for them. But it's hard, losing her like this. She paused, then added, I'm just glad you made peace with her. I like to think she's in a better place now. Me too, Drew agreed softly. Let me know if there's anything I can do. Thank you, Drew. Jess's memorial service was held 2 weeks later, and Drew attended to support her parents. According to the autopsy results, both Tom and Ryan, like Jess, were also HIV positive. Police determined that after learning of their diagnoses, Tom had shot Jess, his son, and then himself. Drew spent a few days in quiet mourning, reflecting on the happier years he'd once shared with Jess. One day, Rebecca Cooper, a colleague, stopped by his desk. "Hey, cowboy," she said with a smile. "Care to join us for happy hour tonight? You look like you could use a little company." Drew almost declined, but after a pause, he smiled back. I could use some company. I'll be there." "Great," she said. "Meet us at Hitchhikers after work, okay?" "I'll be there," he replied, feeling a small spark of hope for the first time in a while. After she left, he thought, life goes on, and so will I.